Good morning, everyone. Hi, and welcome to the 6th episode of this webinar series. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. If you've joined us previously and come back for more, it's fantastic to have you. If it's your first time joining us, thank you and welcome. It's great to have you here. Now, we have the topic of today is going to be company shares for startups and SMEs. So some things that we're going to cover off in today's episode. We're going to look at the rights and responsibilities of shareholders. We're going to look at what nominal value is, what the nominal value is and what that should be set at. We'll take a look at the difference between the nominal value of shares and the market value of shares. And we'll have a look at how many shares you should be issuing in your company when looking to incorporate. We'll also take a look at when the shares have to be paid up and making changes and how you may be able to fix any common mistakes that we see with shares. Now, just in case you're wondering who we are, my name is Liam. I am your host for this webinar series. I'm also one of the managers here with First Formations. Prior to working at First Formations, my experience has been in the finance industry, predominantly in consumer credit sales, sales analysis and sales management. And I'm joined again by Nicholas Campion, who is our Chartered Company Secretary and Governance Professional, as well as one of the directors here with First Formations. And he also heads up our sister brand, Linear Kosak. Now, just a couple housekeeping points before we jump into everything today. But what we're on a Zoom call, so everyone will be muted just so you can hear us clearly. And we have listened to your feedback. Thank you so much for sending all that through. We've changed the way that we're doing the webinars just a little bit today. So what you're going to have is you're going to listen to us speak for roughly about 20-30 minutes, and then we've given much more time at the end for all your questions. So we'll have about 30 minutes at the end of the Q&A. So as we're going through the webinar, any questions you may have that pop up, feel free to pop them in the chat function. And like I say, we'll get to as many questions as we can towards the second half of the webinar episode today. And we look forward to hearing all of those questions because we've got all that time for you. So please do send them through. Now, just in case you are wondering who First Formations are, so we're the UK's leading company formations agent. We've helped we've helped thousands and thousands of customers form over 1 million companies, and we do this with our signature incorporation packages, as well as a whole host of secretarial services that you can use to manage your company even after incorporation, as well as our ever popular address services. So like I say, let's get started with today. Today's topic is going to be company shares and for startups and for SMEs. So let's get started just firstly with some basics here. So Nick, can you give me an explanation or give us an explanation of what shares are?
Very simply, well, shares, if I would describe it in a single word, is a unit of ownership or interest in a company. So when we're talking about here today is in the context of a private company limited by shares. We're going to talk about that. It's not the only corporate entity type that you can register here in the UK, but it is by far the most popular one that is used here. I think well over 95% of all corporate entities registered in the UK are that of a private company limited by shares. Now, as I say, the shares represent the ownership or the interest in that company. So the holder or holders therefore become the shareholders, the owners, or to use the term under the Companies Act, the legal term, the members. Just FYI, you'll often see, and we'll probably do this a little bit here today, we use the terms members and shareholders interchangeably. They mean the same thing in this context. The shareholders are the members, just in the same way there may be other corporate entities out there where they'll have members as well, the owners, but they may not be members by virtue of holding shares. They may not exist. Now, a company will have a series of shares, maybe one, maybe many. Exactly how many they issue is on a case-by-case basis, and we'll have a little look later on how that's structured, how that's put together. But your holders, your owners, are the ones that hold those shares in the company.
And exactly, so it's all in the name, isn't it? So to hold shares in a company, you're normally going to have a company limited by shares. So what rights then does a shareholder hold?
Well, normally quite a lot of rights are held by the shareholders or the persons holding the shares. By holding those shares, and we'll talk about who's considered the shareholder a little bit later, the share confers certain rights and indeed certain responsibilities onto the holder of those shares. Now, it does depend on a case-by-case basis, of course. If I'm going to take a very standard company, let's just say one that you and I have formed through first formations using our standard packages, our standard articles of association, or maybe you've gone off and formed your company yourself, maybe directly with Companies House using the model articles or something like that. If we just take a standard company, a bog standard company, the holding of the share usually gives you the right to hold, I think, 3 key things. First and foremost is the right to receive a dividend if and when the company has or declares any. That's the big one. That's the one that everyone loves. It's the bit where you get the money. The other big one is to do with control. By virtue of being a shareholder, a member, you will be entitled to receive notice of and the ability to attend any general meetings of the shareholders that take place. And therefore any resolutions, any decisions that are put to the general meeting, you would therefore be able to vote upon. And indeed, even any votes that need to be taken or carried out by the members outside of the general meeting through a written resolution, you'll normally be able to have your say there as well. So that's another big one. It's all about control there. So you've got your dividends, the happy money coming in, you've got the voting control, and you also have a third right, which most shareholders will have in the course of being a shareholder, which is the right to participate in capital distributions. So easiest way I can describe it is through an example. Let's just say your company's winding up for whatever reason. There's still assets left in the company. Those assets need to be divvied out. And those are normally divvied out to the shareholders. So your company's winding up, it hasn't got any liabilities, it's still got assets to a certain amount on. By being a shareholder, you are entitled to participate to those or participate in the distributions of those assets. Now, in practical terms, your absolute rights here are dictated on a case-by-case basis. As I say, it can differ from company to company. It will be determined by the proportion of shares you hold versus anybody else, be it if you're the only shareholder in which you get all the rights, or maybe you're sharing this with other people. We also have to consider what the rights actually attached to those shares really are. As I say, we've talked about the standard company. This can differ if we start looking at introducing multiple share classes with different rights on them. We can, it's sort of outside our brief little discussion today, but if we'd like to discuss that in the Q&A, absolutely send your questions through and we can discuss how multiple share classes throws a bit of, I say hair in the soup, but it sort of makes it all a bit more interesting for good reason too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and if multiple share classes is something that you'd like to hear a little bit more about, feel free to pop a question into the chat function, and like I say, we'll get to as many questions as we can in the second half of this webinar episode. Now, as is normally the case with the Companies Act, wherever you have rights, there are generally going to be some responsibilities attached to those. So what responsibilities then, Nick, does a shareholder have?
I think the big one, mercifully, shareholders don't have a great deal of responsibilities. I think really the key thing about being a shareholder is the enjoyment of rights. That's not to say there aren't any responsibilities. I think the big responsibility is probably the liability you are likely to take on by being a shareholder. We always talk about how registering a private limited company in whatever context limits the liability that the shareholders, the owners, have to pay. For example, if worst comes to worst and the company fails or ends up in financial distress, it does protect your personal assets. Well, that's fantastic, but what is the actual liability? What is it limited to? We keep talking about limited by shares, what have you. The liability that a shareholder takes up is principally derived by what we call the issue price of the shares. Okay? So the issue price is the amount that you agree to you agree to pay when receiving those shares. For 99% of companies, for those watching this webinar today, for most people, the liability will just be what we call the nominal value of the shares. Every share has a nominal value. Okay? The best way I can describe it, and there's lots of ways this gets described online, even in my own industry, I think people are not great at defining it. The best way I can, in my opinion, describe it is a nominal value is the minimum amount that the person must pay or agree to pay in order to be given a share. And that amount, that nominal value, then represents the total liability if it's not paid up to the company should you ever need to pay for it. And we can talk. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that later when we actually have to pay for these shares. Okay, so that represents the core bit of your liability. That's not to say that's the only liability you take up. Sometimes, I don't want to muddy the waters too much, for most people, most companies out there, the nominal value will be the full extent of the liability that you have to take up. But sometimes shares can be issued at higher than the minimum amount, higher than the nominal value. That difference, so let's just say we got a nominal value of £1, which is by far and away the most common nominal value that gets set. We'll talk about the consequences in just a moment. Let's just say you do set a nominal value of £1. Great, that's your minimum. But I agree that I'm going to issue certain shares to a person, and I'm going to say, well, you're going to have to pay me £1.50 if you want me to issue you some shares. Your £1 is the nominal value, and the 50p therefore is what we call the premium. Taken together, the £1.50, that's the total issue price. We can call it the market value. And that, again, if it hasn't been paid up, will be the liability which people have to will have to pay at some point. So again, we need to sort of separate those two, this nominal value out and the actual issue price. And in terms of what a good nominal value is, as I say, 99% of companies are registered with £1 nominal value, and probably the other one is probably a penny. In practical terms, for most people, it's not really going to affect us too much. It does provide a great influence on what a shareholder's liability will be. But certainly in the context of this webinar, it's not something that you have to give too much thought about.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so I guess just to expand on that a little bit there, so if we're talking about that nominal value, if people are in the process of setting up a company, or maybe you're just thinking of, restructuring a couple bits and pieces, what advice would you give when setting or when thinking of setting a nominal value for the shares, either at incorporation or indeed afterwards?
I think firstly we need to once again take into account two values here. The nominal value, that minimum that we talked about, and the market value, which is separate. Okay, your nominal value never changes, it stays at this base forever, and your market value will kind of disassociate itself from the normal value, will deviate, it will go higher. To what extent, I don't know, that depends on your company. So first of all, let's get out of that mind. In terms of setting the nominal value, as I said, the most common amount is £1. And what I'm trying to say here is that when you're forming a company, or maybe you're looking back at your company that you've already formed and you're thinking, hang on, was that the proper amount to reflect my company? What you're not doing when you're setting the nominal value, which as I say is done at incorporation, what you're not doing is trying to ascertain, hang on, I'm setting up a brand new company, which is, it's in an industry I've worked in for a long time. I've got lots of clients. We're going to be really successful right from the off. I need to capture that worth into the nominal value. This is going to give me a per share value of £20. That's not what you're trying to do. That's not what you're trying to do, and you shouldn't try to do so, because that is going to cause problems a little bit later. If you start setting your nominal value very high, you're going to cause problems as regards putting out a large liability to it. So don't worry in trying to capture the value or the perceived value of the shares of the company into those shares. Again, we're just talking about that minimum base. I mean, there's a great example. British Airways, world famous airline. The British Airways was formed in 1974, and it was an amalgamation or a merger of multiple working airlines at the time. Okay. Now, if you go onto the incorporation documents for British Airways, and you can do this on the public profile, it's still available, 1974 being incorporated, you will find on the incorporation documents that the nominal value was set at £1. And I don't think anybody could sit there and say, well, in 1974 each share was worth £1. And the nominal value was. Okay, so don't worry about it being so low. That's the overriding thing of what I'm trying to say here. And ultimately, and there are various reasons, if you find that you do need to change it at a later date, then it's not set in stone. It can be done subject to the relevant approvals.
Mm-hmm. And just to kind of expand a little bit more, like I say, if you've got further questions on this topic, the nominal value versus the market value, please do pop your questions into that chat function. But just to go a little bit further, you've mentioned market value and versus the nominal value and how we need to disassociate the two because they're separate. But say someone has a company that, just pulling a number off the top of my head, maybe worth £500,000. At what point do the shares go from being the nominal value to that market value?
Absolutely. So again, and I'm sorry to sound like a scratch record, I don't think there's a point or a certain point in time where suddenly they go from this nominal value to the market value. No, the two values always are running in tandem. You should see each share as having two different values. The nominal value, that minimum amount, and the market value, what it actually is. And the market value is going to do its own thing, it's going to go crazy, it's going to have a great time, or maybe sometimes not such a great time. But at what point does it merge between the two? Well, again, when does the market value take off and become that reflect that $500,000 that you've just described? Well, I think the economic answer is, number one, when someone's willing to pay that amount. That ultimately is what the price of something or the value of something is. It could, but in the specific context, it could be soon after incorporation. You could be getting going, moving very quickly, getting a lot of revenue, what have you, and that company might therefore be worth $500,000, and that would be reflected in the shares. And that might happen straight away, that might happen later. But for the avoidance of doubt, it's not a case that we start the nominal value and at a certain point it goes off in your market value. Your nominal and your market starts off at incorporation, and we start going into business, living life, and the market value will go off, but the nominal value remain all the time. That's really what I would say to that. And if we're asking in terms of valuation, at what point can we value it? Is it when we get our first set of accounts in? Is it when someone tries to buy us or what have you? Really, that's again, I think that's not a particularly valid way of looking at it. It's when someone's willing to pay that amount, and it could be straight away or straight afterwards. And if we are talking about valuations, how do I work out the value of each share in terms of the market value? Oftentimes, this is an industry by industry thing. A lot of industries like to use a multiplier of EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. But really, that's something that you'll have to do your homework on.
Lovely. And I guess then that brings us to the next big component when it comes to shares. So if we've looked at the nominal value, the other component is going to be how many shares should you issue overall when setting up your company? And can you give us a bit of guidance on I guess, how many overall shares there should be in the company?
Yes, I can. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer to this. I wish there was. It is a question that has to be answered on a case-by-case basis. And I think what we're not talking about is what we assign specific individuals. I think we're going to talk about that next, actually. But we're talking about the total share capital in the company in its entirety. So if we have to do it on a case-by-case basis, what sort of considerations do we need to take into account? Well, first and foremost, we need to talk practical terms. First of all, what's the absolute minimum that we can get away with? Well, the minimum by logic is at least one share needs to be issued into the company. Okay? Fantastic. Got the one. That might be the only thing that you issue. Brilliant. The next question you have to ask is, well, how many shareholders am I going to have? I need a number that means that I can apportion the amount that I want to different shareholders. Okay, we often talk about the total number of shares being easily divisible, and I think that's really, really important. If I'm looking, this is why a lot of people use 10 shares as your total capital, 100 shares, 1,000 shares, and plenty beyond as well. And they do that because it's really easy to portion the correct percentages to people. For example, and if you look at it from a mathematical basis, if I need to give someone, Liam, if you and I were setting up a company and I wanted to give, if I was feeling a bit conservative and I thought I only want to give you 1.5%, then I wouldn't do that, but from a mathematical perspective, then I can't issue 10 shares in total in the company because the lowest amount that I can give someone or give that share to would represent 10% of the company. So maybe I need to look at maybe issuing 1,000 shares in total, giving you 15 shares out of that or what have you. So you've got to think about what you need to give other people. And you also have to think about what's happening in the future. Am I going to bring other people into this? How does that affect the maths? Okay, and it might be the case that I need to increase the amount of shares that you're going to get in the future too. So that's a key thing to think about. And the other one to think about is the liability. Of course, we keep talking about liability here. We keep talking about that. So how many shares do we, what can you stomach? What can you stomach in terms of the collective shareholders in total? If I've got a capital of 10,000 shares of £1 each, then that would imply a liability of at least £10,000. Maybe that's something that myself and you, as we go into business, is not something that we really can take on. So it's sort of a matrix of those considerations, which is eventually going to get you to a number, which hopefully will be right. Again, with these things, it can be changed later. We'll talk about how we can change things, and that's another thing I want to pick up in the Q&A if that's what the audience would like to speak about. In terms of our recommendation for most companies out there, I think 100 is a great number to work on. Yeah, it's a great number to work on. It gives you enough to play with. I can apportion as little as 1% to people if I so wish. Gives you a little bit of a playroom for moving on without incurring this massive liability. You issue too many shares, working in tandem with your nominal value, well, you're ruining the whole point of limited liability by creating a massive liability, which probably renders this whole thing a little bit redundant. And again, just don't worry about, what I would say to people is don't worry about having a large share capital, okay? Share capital is oftentimes, the number of issued shares is not indicative of the success of a company or the likely success in the future. And what I mean by that is, here's another example, EasyJet. You can tell I like aviation, but EasyJet, again, that particular company was formed in 2000, the trading entity, which is now a public company. You go on the incorporation documents on there, I think they were issued with 1 share. I mean, again, no one's going to say that EasyJet is a tiny company, even back then. And I think that's a good demonstration of not tying the success or the future success of the company, trying to reflect that into the number of shares being issued.
Yeah, definitely. And excellent considerations to have there. So I guess you've guessed it completely right. We are going to then look at, so if you do have more than 1 shareholder in the company, you've looked at your overall shares, but how many shares should each individual hold?
I think, again, that is a difficult question to ask in general terms. It is on a case-by-case basis. I'm sorry, a lot of these questions, unfortunately, are answered on a case-by-case basis. I wish I could sit here and say, this is your definitive answer. But again, let's take into account some of the considerations. And again, let's start with the practical considerations that we have to factor into account. Again, what are the minimums? What is the absolute minimum that I can get away with? Hey, it's a single share per company. Per individual, per shareholder. That's your starting point. And then you've got to start thinking in more practical or maybe even political terms in terms of expectations. What's the expectations on your part? What's the expectations on the person who's seeking to join the company? Are they looking to come in as an equal partner? Are you wanting them to come in as an equal partner who's going to share half of the rewards which the company bestows on you both? That's a key question that you want to think of. And you also want to think of, what am I getting for this person that's joining your company? Are they bringing expertise? Are they bringing money? Are they bringing both? Are they bringing neither? That is a key thing that you have to take into account. And again, are they coming to you? Is the ball in your park to set the amount, or are you going to them? You're trying to attract someone, particularly if you're trying to attract a business partner or maybe a senior hire. That can change, I guess, the dynamic of the offering that you're going to have to try and give. And then let's just think about yourself for a minute. Let's think on a bit of a selfish basis. I mean, you've set up. Go on. You're setting up or have set up a company. You worked blood and sweat into the business. Lost a lot of sleep, lost a lot of weekends, lost a lot of your social life, building something, and suddenly someone comes along and says, "I want half of what you've got." Is that something that you can stomach? Is that appropriate? Maybe that's out of the question. It would take a heck of a lot coming inwards for me to give something away like that. If a person comes in and gives you £20,000 and says, right, you've got a company maybe worth, I don't know, £200,000, and the person comes in with £20,000 investment and says, I'd like half of your company. Well, hang on a minute, is that an appropriate reward in exchange for what they can offer. If it's just money that they're providing, maybe it is something to consider if they can give you something else. I think what we would describe here, the way we look at it is looking at it in terms of return for the person coming on, rather than just simply on a binary equity stake. If they give me such and such amount, or they bring such and such into the business, I give them this amount in return. What are they going to get in return? What's the practical amount? What's the money that they're going to get in terms of dividends or what have you? Or if you're going into a sale, maybe an exit in 3-4 years, what are they going to get? Rather than just sitting here thinking, oh, good Lord, I need to give this person 5, 10, 15, or maybe much more as regards percentage. What you certainly don't want to do, just to clarify, and this happens with businesses that have just started, you don't want to magnanimously give this person a lot of the shares, give a lot of control over, just because, well, you felt the ball was in their park, or you felt they were very important, and they might not turn out to be. I think the key way of looking at it is what is the return they'll get. And that's something that we would always advise speaking to an accountant for helping you ascertain what that return is, and using that as the equation. But as I say, so that was the second point I was trying to make. We had the minimum, the practical amounts that you have to give if you're looking to bring someone on as a shareholder in whatever context. Right, what's the minimum you can get away with from a practical perspective? It's 1 share. You've got the expectations, everything we described. And the other big one is control. I'll try and power through this one. Again, and particularly if you're talking about this being your baby, your company, how much are you willing of control that you're willing to give away? And what do we actually mean by control? Well, what we're really talking about is the ability to vote. And when we're talking about the ability to vote, there's 2 key percentages that you need to take into account. The first of which is 50% plus 1, so north of 50%. And that's significant because you need 50% plus 1% to pass an ordinary resolution. An ordinary resolution of the shareholders is the common shareholder decisions that they may need to make from time to time. It could relate just to some adjustments to the share capital, entry into an agreement. I don't know. If that's sort of your marker, do you want someone to have the ability to block an ordinary resolution? And they can do so if they've got at least 50% of the voting rights. The other key threshold you need to think about is 75% or more. And 75% is important because that represents what's required for a special resolution to be passed. That's another shareholder resolution, and it's significant because these are the special decisions that shareholders have to make some time. Some extraordinary decisions they have to make some time. For example, if you're looking to change the Articles of Association, the main constitution of your document, if you want to do that, you need to pass a special resolution. So if I'm going to give someone 25%, or just over 25%, I should say, they could block a special resolution. Maybe that's okay. Maybe I want to say, okay, there's certain decisions that we have to agree together, those special resolutions, in which case you can have 25% or more. Yeah. But I want to be able to at least pass an ordinary resolution on my own. That's a key consideration, and we're talking about proportions here rather than the physical numbers of shares that we have to take into account. Okay, so control, again, massive. Finally, 2 more things. We've got liability. Again, the number of shares, the more shares you go up, the higher your liability will be. That stands to reason. It's just a mathematical equation. And you don't want to set that too high, again, overall, because, again, you're ruining the whole idea of limiting the liability that a shareholder has. And again, in the future, what are your future plans? I want to maybe bring other people on board. Maybe I want to increase the amount that I originally gave you as a part of a reward. That is the sort of thing that you have to factor in. Now, just to take a very quick example here, what we have, let's just say that you are bringing on an important business partner early on in your career, early on in the business's career. And they are going to be important. They're bringing money and they're bringing expertise that you really, really, really do need. And you think to yourself, okay, all right, if I'm thinking about the percentages that I'm going to provide to you, I think there are certain decisions that you and I need to agree on. Changing the main constitution of the company, for example. So maybe I'm happy that a special resolution can only pass with yours and I's approval. But maybe that ultimately there are certain decisions, or common shareholder decisions, which from a control perspective I need to have. I want to have that control. So I can give you more than 25%. I don't have to worry about that threshold because it's within my appetite. But if I don't want to give you anywhere near the 50% because otherwise that endangers my ability to pass an ordinary resolution. So why don't we just say 40%? That might be an area that you end up. I'm not saying that's the amount that you should give to someone, but that's the area that you might come into.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I guess when we've taken all of these considerations into consideration, when then do you actually have to start thinking about paying up those shares?
Absolutely. So just very briefly, shares generally speaking are paid up when the shares are issued. So when you agree to take on the shares, if they're not, if there are certain amounts unpaid, it might be some or all of them, then what happens is there's a few ways that this can come out. You could either pay it back on an agreed schedule that you agreed with the company, or the company has agreed with you, or by calling of the directors. The directors have decided, all right, we need the money, so we're going to call it up. That's what that is. Or it's on a wind up. Again, let's just say the company is winding up. It has liabilities to fulfill, so it's going to ask for those unpaid elements. It is entirely possible, and it happens to a lot of small companies. It's entirely possible that that a shareholder can go through their entire life without actually ever having to pay up the shares. Right? There are only certain circumstances that might take place.
Definitely. And just before we jump into, we've got a couple more before we jump into the audience questions, but can the structure or the structure of the shares actually be changed after incorporation?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of this is not set in stone, so long as you can get the relevant approvals. So I think, I don't want people to go around thinking, good Lord, it's done, it's dusted, I'll never be able to sort this out. Plenty of things in a structure can change. The number of shares, the nominal value, who has the shares, and so forth. This can all be dealt with so long as you get the relevant approvals, which is oftentimes is the trickiest bit. Can you just get the approval rather than can you actually do it? And remember, share structures change all the time. It could be because there was some mistakes at incorporation. It happens all the time. As we find out more, or find out on the expectations of what is required. Or it could be that the plans of the company have changed. I wouldn't want everybody to think that, well, if I'm having to change the share capital after incorporation, what the makeup of the share capital or its shareholdings are, then that's an indication of failure. It's not. It's oftentimes a classic evolution of the company. For example, before a company goes through pre-seed investment or go through Series A and what have you, investment, oftentimes a lot of the work we do is in anticipation of that, breaking down, increasing the number of shares, breaking down that nominal value, getting it into a position. So changing the share capital, let's get outside of that idea that it's all, we do that if it's all gone wrong. It's not always the case. It could be the natural evolution of the company. If you do find yourself in need of that, then obviously we would advise speaking to, get yourself a good company secretarial agent to sort that out for you. As I say, can deal with a lot of things. Just by way of pure illustration, the number of shares, the nominal value, the rights associated with the shares. We might look to vary it up, change them a little bit. That can all be dealt with.
Mm-hmm. And if you do find you want to make some changes, feel free to give our team a call, jump on live chat on our website, or even send us an email, and we can obviously help out, wherever we can. Now, this is an interesting question, I like this one, but how would we go about fixing some of the common mistakes that you've noticed in your day-to-day dealing with shares?
Yeah, this is easy. I think probably the three big ones, Liam, and this happens, and it does just happen. And it can be dealt with. The number one, I think, probably the most important common incorporation mistake that I come across in the context of what we're talking about here today is probably that too many shares have been issued. Too many shares have been issued, and you get some crazy liability. I had one company, I think it was a month or two ago now, with something like 10 billion shares that were issued. issued with £1 as well. There's not many people that can have the appetite to withstand that liability. Certainly I couldn't. And that can be dealt with. The number of shares can be dealt with. It's you would go through what's called a reduction of capital procedure, pending the relevant approvals. Not to say it's a simple thing or something that you just wave off and pretend it didn't happen. I won't go into the details. If we can go into the details in the Q&A if we want to. But it's you're signing a solvency statement, big commitment on the part of the directors to do. But that can be brought down. That's probably the first thing. Let's get that number of shares down. Let's reduce that liability and stop you having this horrible thing hanging over your head. The other big thing is actually maybe it's the nominal value that's too high, in which case, again, maybe a reduction of capital is probably the way to go about it. Okay. Again, we've sort of ruined that great benefit we get from limited by liability because the nominal value is so high. You times that by the number of shares. Suddenly you end up with those silly numbers. Again, with a total liability of say 10 billion or something like that. It does happen. It's very easy to issue 10,000 shares of £10,000 each. You do the maths. Most people couldn't deal with that. And the other thing, of course, has too much control been given to someone else? We talked a little bit earlier about what can we give someone, what's appropriate, and maybe actually hang on a minute. I'm sorry, we did make a mistake when we started out, or when you came on board, whenever that might have been. We need to adjust this, and there's various ways you can adjust it. By and large, you do need consent if you haven't put these things in place, mechanisms in place beforehand to deal with them, like through a shareholder agreement. But you can deal with that, and if you have given too much control to somebody else, well, maybe you need to claw some of those shares back. Maybe just through a transfer of shares. If it's all harmonious, say, well, I need to have some of these shares back. This is this is probably not what's required. Or I could look to increase my holdings. So you know what, just keep those shares. We're going to issue my shares so that I again get the sort of the overwhelming amount. That's a way to do it. There's other ways you can do this. Reduction of capital can come into this again. Purchases of own shares might be appropriate. The exact route that you deal with all the issues that I've described does depend on the case. Look at that again. It's case by case, on the case by case basis again. And usually there are certain accounting and sometimes legal considerations you need to take into account which determine the exact route that you take. But again, I guess the overall thing I'm trying to say here is that common mistakes, those three ones I talked about, number of shares, nominal value of shares, and control, can be dealt with. And obviously, as I say, if that's something you want to discuss in the Q&A, very happy to.
Absolutely, yeah. If that's sounding a little bit familiar, or you may have some questions regarding that, feel free to pop your questions into the chat, and we will get to those ones. I promise we will get to those just after this last question. And this is something that we have said in previous episodes. We're going to continue saying it. You'll hear it till we're black and blue in the face. But what we're talking about is good record keeping. We know it's vital for companies. So talk to us about the records you'd need to keep in regards to shares. Okay,
yep. Really easy questions once. So the big one is going to be what's called the Register of Members. This is a statutory document, meaning it's required by law of every single company to maintain a register, a document which says who owns your company. I call it the Bible of the company. If you are a shareholder, you are in that book, in the Bible. And if you're not in the Bible, if you're not in the Register of Members, then you are not a shareholder. And the Register of Members will have basic information about the shareholdings. So what are their names? What are their addresses? What are their exact holdings? When did they receive them? And so forth. And maybe when did it move about? That determines that it's a really important document under the eyes of the law, particularly if there are any issues that come up. That is something that you have to maintain at all times. That's the key thing for records. Now, oftentimes people will say, well, what about a cap table or a capitalization table? A capitalization table is more of a working document. It's something that people just do because it suits them. They might need it for a third party. I think banks, investors, lenders, they all want to, when they engage with you, say, well, give me a cap table. What does the cap table show? It shows you a snapshot of the shareholdings, the structure of the shares, and who holds them. It's basically just an easy visual way of saying, right, what's the state of this company, right? It's not a legal document. As I say, it's more of a working, practical document that's come about that oftentimes people will ask for, but again, it's not provided for by law. but you may find that you are asked for it every so often.
Absolutely. And so we're going to jump straight into the questions now. So let's have a look at what we've got. So, Nick, can you give shares to new employees as part of an employment offer?
Yes, of course you can. And this figures into a lot of people's, a lot of companies that are early on in their career, in their lives. Providing equity to new employees is very important to a lot of people as part of attracting talent. You know, particularly if you're a new startup or you're an SME, you know, a person's got the ability to either join a large, well-established firm versus your company, which might be rather small, very good, but still rather small. There may be a temptation to go with a larger company, a bit more, maybe they're able to award more. So equity is probably a very important tool that people use. So you can provide it to employees as part of the offer, and it might go out in the contract or what have you, or just the initial offer that goes out and says, well, you're going to get, I don't know, 10% of the shares in the company. Now, there's a massive asterisk to this because when we're dealing with shares, particularly related to employment-related securities, so shares relating to a person's employment, there's a lot of considerations you need to take into account. First and foremost, number one, you know, what happens if the person leaves? What happens if it doesn't work out? What if, say, I joined a new company, they said you're going to get some shares, and the relationship completely broke down? And let's just say, and I hope this never happens, but let's just say they said, I'm sorry, we're letting you go. What about the shares that they've given me? How do I get them back? You know, in simple terms, you'd be looking at mechanisms that kick in to get those shares back. Well, no, in the context of what we're talking about, they're called good leaver, bad leaver provisions. And say, look, if it's a bad leaver, they got fired, then they automatically get returned to such and to the company or something to that extent. For maybe nothing, you know, I have to give them back. So number one, if you are going to give shares, make sure you have a way of getting those back. That's a really important thing. The second thing is that can be pretty big tax considerations to take into account. You've got to deal with this with your accountant. Unfortunately, it isn't as simple as just issuing shares to someone. Say, hey, you're going to have 10% of the shares. I need to issue X number of shares. That's going to give you 10% in total. Number one, they're probably going to have to pay for those shares. And number two, could be quite a bit of tax to pay, particularly when they sell them on or what have you. The way you get around that, or you can't get around that's a fact of life, unfortunately, but you can do things to mitigate that. For example, a tax advantage share scheme. The big ones, the one everybody loves for good reason is called an EMI, Enterprise Management Incentive. Which allows you to give shares to employees in a manner which is very tax efficient and really can benefit them. Mm-hmm. You can't give these things away for free, unfortunately, but you can reduce the liabilities that arise from it. So EMIs is a great one. CSOP, company share option plans, is another great plan. So probably, I guess if you're going to rank them, everyone's always going to say EMI, go for that if you can. Some companies can't because they might be in an industry which is excluded, or maybe a CSOP, and that helps with, to some extent, how things get paid. The tax consequences for both the company and the person taking them on. You know, if I bring on somebody, I don't want to lay on a huge amount of tax out of nowhere. Yeah, welcome on board. You've got a big bill to pay. It's probably not very particularly nice welcome. So, means of getting these things back. Means of I would always consider looking into a share option scheme. Mm-hmm. To make sure that the tax doesn't go crazy. And also, you also want to consider: do I want to give the offer straight away? Do I want to give all those shares straight away? That 10% I offered you, am I going to give it right at the point that you join us? Or maybe, as part of your incentive, I'm going to give you, I could vest them over 3 years. You get 4% or 2% to be in the first year, another 2% of the shares in the second year, and then the final 6% in the third year. It's a great way of tying people on. So, in summary, I've said a lot. Sorry about that. There's a lot to talk about, though. It's a whole area, an industry in its own right. Number one, Of course you can. Number two, make sure you can get those shares back if it all goes south. Number two, be aware, big tax considerations to look into. Do not do this without advice. And of course, number three, what sort of plan are we looking? Is it straight away? Is it staggered? Whatever works with you.
Excellent, yeah. And next question we've got here is, I wanted to transfer part of my shares to my children, but is there a minimum age requirement of a shareholder in the UK?
No, okay, this question comes up many times. I understand that, if you're under the age of 18, being a minor, there's a lot of things you can't do. In the UK, under the Companies Act, there is nothing that prevents a minor from receiving shares. Yeah, you can transfer them over, pending the usual approvals and what have you. But there's nothing in the Act, the Companies Act 2006, which says you have to be above a certain age. It says you have to be a certain age to be a director, but there's no such requirement to be a shareholder. I would say that some companies will put restrictions in, and this is maybe why some of this this misunderstanding does occasionally, as I say, a lot of people think that, does sort of continue. Insofar as the restrictions might be in place which might prevent a minor from receiving the shares, but again, as regards to the law, there's nothing to prevent that. Now, that's not to say that there are no considerations you have to take into account. Okay, they are a minor; they can't contract, they can't agree, they can't enter into a contract themselves. So, is it worth? That might cause problems for the company, which is why sometimes they restrict it. But again, just to answer the question, basic terms, no. UK, if you're a minor, if you're 2 years old, of course you can take shares. I wish I was given shares when I was 2.
That would be nice, yeah. Now this is the next one's a bit of a juicy one. We may have covered it a little bit with that first question, but what is the meaning of different share classes? So, for example, A, B, C, that'd be alphabet shares. And what should one take into consideration if I want to create a staff share scheme in the future, but do not wish to pass control of the business over to staff?
Okay, there's a couple of questions, and I think it does touch a little bit on what I asked, what I was talking about earlier. But let's just break it down. So first and foremost, the question was, what's the meaning of different share classes, A, B, C, that we're talking about? To put that very simply, every share in the company has to be equal. Okay, so the rights of one share has to be equal to another. That's a hard and fast rule that can't be changed. The only way it can be changed is if you start categorizing them into different classes. And each share in that class, in a certain class, has to have equal rights to each other. But I can differ the rights between the classes, the shares of one class versus the shares of another class. And that's a great way of differing the rights and responsibilities that certain people are going to have. The most common one is alphabet shares, and it's common because these are fairly simple shares that are put together with only small deviations. Maybe in the amount of voting rights that are put in, right? And that's where this whole A ordinary, B ordinary, C ordinary, it's just a way of categorizing them, right? So we don't have to worry about that too much. So when we talk about different classes of shares, what we're saying is we're categorizing groups of shares into different classes from one another, and it may be the case that these shares in one class may have different rights to the other. There's a million reasons why you'd want to do that. To answer the second question, which was what are the considerations in creating a staff share scheme, but and I guess that's more of an incentive purpose rather than simply handing over control. Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, the considerations you need to take into account: get the best scheme that works for you. As I say, EMI is, again, I don't think it's wrong for me to say this, but I think it's definitely the most popular one. And if you can go for it, because the amount of shares that you can give to your shareholders and the restrictions that are placed on when and where are pretty lax, is probably the favoured route of a lot of companies. And the only reason many people don't go for that one is because certain activities, certain companies in certain industries, for example, if you're an accountant, are excluded from using EMI. So number one, what's the best scheme for me? And what works for me as a company in terms of what I'm giving them, where and when? EMI is usually top, CSOP's usually there. There are other schemes as well. So your consideration of, you need to actually think, what's the purpose of this? Is this the purpose as part of the succession plan that in the future lots of people are going to own the company? As I seek to take a step back, what scheme works for me? How can I make sure that all of my employees, if they are going to receive the shares, are going to be inundated with large bills, tax bills, pending what happens in the future. Those are just some of the things that I would consider, in addition to what we discussed a little bit earlier. Again, things like vesting. Is it something that you want to chuck at people straight away? Do I want to give such a large amount of my company straight away? Or do I want to stagger it? To keep people around?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah. Now, next question we have is, if you want to issue or transfer shares in a company, is it your directors or your shareholders who need to approve this?
Okay, in the strictest of terms, it would be the directors approving a share transfer. The directors have to ensure that certain conditions are met, that a properly executed instrument of transfer, usually a stock transfer form, is presented to the company. They have to make sure that all rules with respect to the company are fulfilled. Those rules will usually be in the Articles of Association. They have to ensure that any stamp duty, if it's payable, has been paid. So the directors are the ones that ultimately will sign off and say, yep, this is good, stick it in the Register of Members. Remember, I told you, if you're a shareholder, you've got to be in the Register of Members. The directors have ultimate responsibility for updating that. So it's their call to say, right, we are going to accept this and we're going to put it in. Oftentimes there will be times where they can reject it, and there may be rules that they have to abide by. Sometimes shareholders do need to get involved. Not in most companies. Most companies are formed using those basic model articles, or our own articles as well, where there's no shareholder approval necessary. But that's not to say not all companies will have that. I don't want to get into this too much, but sometimes with a transfer or more specifically with an issue, I've been talking more about transfers, but I think the question was about issuances as well. But for transfers and issues, oftentimes there is what are called preemption rights to worry about. And I don't want to go, this is a whole question, it's a whole webinar in its own right. But what you have is these preemption rights are basically a right of first refusal to say, hang on a minute, we're going to issue these shares, or we're going to transfer these shares, but we have to go to the other shareholders first and say, hey guys, do you want to pay for these and take them up yourself? And they have to say no before you're allowed to give them out to these other persons who may not be part of the company yet. Or it's a way of preventing people losing control, being unfairly diluted, and so forth. So that's ultimately in all of this. It's a director decision so long as all the usual requirements, all the usual rules, be it in the Articles of Association or the Act, have been met.
Definitely. And we've got a nice practical question for you now, Nick. How difficult is it to change a company's number of shares from 2, with one share being held by 2 people, so they each hold 1, to 100 shares, and then one shareholder is holding 25% and the other holding 75%?
Okay, look, in practical terms, let's not be around the bush, it's fairly easy. Yeah, these are fairly common. That question, Liam, is a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Okay? People do this. This happens all the time. There's various ways you can get around to it. So we're going from one share held by one shareholder, and we need to get to 100 shares with one person holding 75%, one holding 25%. Okay, so I guess one route is that I could simply issue those excess 99 shares. Mm-hmm. And I would issue 25 shares to the other person and 74 shares to the original shareholder. That will get you straight there to the 25%. You'd have to put maybe a bit of money in, about £99 worth if your nominal value is £1. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes it's easy, just issue the additional shares, stick them in, and you get it up to that amount. The alternative, I think, there's other ways you could do it. What you could do is you could subdivide some of the shares. So you take the one share, chop them up through what's called a subdivision. We can help you with this. We chop them up so that suddenly we got 100 shares. We've chopped them up. We chop the 1 into 100. And that you can do that. It just means that the normal value has proportionally decreased. Mm-hmm. So let's say we started with a share of £1. We chopped them up through a subdivision. Now we got 100 shares, which are now worth 1 pence each. The capital still remains. So you got 100 shares, and then I could just transfer 25% over to this other person. And that, again, will get you the 75-25 split that you're looking for. Again, there may be everything I say. You often have to factor accounting or tax considerations. That transfer of shares may give rise to certain liabilities, for example, capital gains tax and all of that. But the actual administrative ways of getting you from the position of one share of £1, say, into 100 shares of whatever, split 75-25. There's good ways, easy ways around it, as long as you can get the approval, as I said.
Yeah, definitely. And if you are in that boat, feel free to give us a call so our team can let you know what options there are available, and we can actually assist you in completing that work. So give us a call, jump on our live chat, or send us an email. Now, another question we have is, how important is it to have voting rights attached to my shares if I'm operating the company alone?
If you're operating the company alone, okay. I'm going to take that. When you say you're operating a company alone, I guess you can mean that you're the sole shareholder, director. Well, I guess it's sort of not. I guess what I would say to that is, well, there needs to be at least one share in issue in the company that has the voting rights. So if you're the sole shareholder, you're going to have the voting rights. I don't think you could probably disapply the voting rights in case how any shareholder decision is going to be made. So if you're operating the company alone, the usual presumption is you're going to have the voting rights. So that's probably not going to be an issue. Now, if you are if we're talking about operating, okay, right, let's say this other way. If you're operating the company as a director on your own with no other directors, but you're not the shareholder, then that will depend on the situation. If that's the arrangement that you've come to with the owners, say, okay, I'm not a shareholder, but I am going to run this company, I am going to be a director. Is it mandatory to have voting rights in your shares? I know this is going a little bit off the question, but is it mandatory to have voting rights for your shares? No, not really. A director's job is to run the company on a day-to-day basis. Only sometimes you have to go to the shareholders. Only sometimes there are certain decisions that have to go to the shareholders. But the whole point is the shareholders take a step back and they delegate the decision. They say, right, I'm not going to get involved with the day-to-day business. I'm going to put it to the directors, or director in this case, and that's fine. That's the basis of many, particularly larger companies.
Yeah.
The directors will occasionally have to go to the shareholders and say, hey, I think we need to do this. I need your approval. Sign it off. But just by being a director, is it absolutely necessary to have voting shares? Not really. No.
Yeah. Okay, and another one we've got is, so is it possible to hide the amount of shares my company holds on the company's house website?
The whole purpose, the information that's made available to the public now is numerous. You go on. I gave you two examples today: British Airways and EasyJet. What they did back in 1974 and 2000. That information is made available publicly, and it's made available for the purposes of corporate transparency. The whole idea of why the government have made it so easy to see this information is to prevent people hiding who's behind the company. It's just making it available, all these submissions, all the shareholder information so easily available is just one route that they've done that. Yeah, there's other things that they've done to make it easier to understand who's behind the company, and they've recently passed the second economic crime bill, which is going to impact that as well. Now, can you suppress the information on there? If you're a shareholder and you're saying, well, I want to hide myself as a shareholder, I think in practical terms, no. I think in practical terms, you're probably not going to. There's probably in extreme cases, you might be able to get the courts may be able to suppress certain information for national security purposes or extreme personal safety matters. Not really a case of I don't want someone to know about this. I'm sorry, no. I think generally speaking, in terms of corporate transparency, it's all going to go out there, and unless you've got a very good reason, I think the courts may be able to help in some manner, but it's just so. It would be so extraordinary. I'm certainly not aware, and I've done this for a very long time now.
Yeah, definitely. Now we've got, just looking at the time, we'll squeeze in a couple more questions. Why not? So if we've got This may be a little bit of a complicated one, but we'll try and get through it anyway. But if a shareholder owns shares in a holding company, but also holds shares in the trading subsidiary, is this problematic, and would this have any implications on potential investors?
Okay, so your shareholder owns shares in your holding company,
Yeah.
which itself has a subsidiary, we'll call it the trading subsidiary, but your shareholder that we just talked about who owns the holding company also holds the shares. Is it problematic? No. Okay, let's talk a bit from a company secretarial perspective to begin with. Is that against the law? No. No, you can do that. I can probably think of a few reasons why you might want to do that. I can also think of a couple of reasons why you wouldn't want to have this sort of split holding. Is it going to be problematic? I guess the investors will it depends on what the investors are going for. If the investors are looking to invest into the holding company, I guess they're expecting to have control or significant interest in on a secondary basis on the subsidiary. Which if they're investing in the holding company, but the holding company only holds X amount in the trading subsidiary, maybe they're going to say, well, hang on a minute, I want full control of that trading subsidiary, which should be held by the holding company. So maybe they may have a problem with that. So maybe you might need to do, I don't know, say an exchange, a share exchange. You'd need tax advice on that. I'm just talking about the mechanisms through which that could take place. It might need to be a case that if you are bringing on an investor who wants that control, who wants that ability to have full control of the subsidiary via the holding company, again, presuming they're going for the holding company, then maybe you need to fix it up beforehand, get yourself so your holding is through the holding company and take it from there. I mean, naturally, you buy a large amount in the holding company on the presumption you get the trading subsidiary, and if you find out that that's not the case, that the holding company doesn't have the full control, of course they're going to be thinking, well, hang on a minute, what am I actually getting here?
Yeah, definitely. And okay, so now this one we may be able to, this may be a very large question in itself, but can you touch on some of the different share classes and the categories available to use and what they may be used for, or how they may be used?
The different share class categories and what they might be used for. There are so many different types of share classes out there. Well, I guess the first one, we sort of touched on it already, the alphabet shares, which is something which a lot of companies go for, where basic variations in the shares are made, in the share rights. For example, you might have the ability to declare variable rates of dividend or different voting rights. The alphabet shares are commonly used in smaller companies, say for the purposes of maybe bringing family on board or maybe friends who are part of the company. That's a common one. Preference shares are probably the more exciting one here. Preference shares, just to give you a very basic basic rundown. Preference shares, the basis, as the name suggests, is the rights of those shares are in preference to the other shareholders. So say, for example, you might have the right to a preference dividend in preference to everybody else. So whatever happens, look, no one's getting any money until the preference shares get their dividend. To cut a very long story short, oftentimes your preference shares will set a certain amount and say, right, you're entitled to an 8% dividend. The 8% is based on the issue price. I won't go into it today, it's a little bit complicated. But you get that 8% dividend before anybody else gets paid anything, right? So the other shareholders will have to wait their turn. Preference shares are really favoured, particularly by investors. They're looking about their returns. We talked about how important returns are rather than necessarily just the equity stake, and that's a good way of demonstrating. They're looking, right, hang on a minute, if I'm going to give this person some money, I want to make sure I'm getting my money's worth out of it. And they will often insist on preference shares being the way they achieve that. That's something that I help a lot of people doing so. And you get a lot of other rights with preference. You can put a lot of other rights with preference shares. Although they're actually, funny enough, they're not often voting rights. That often gets foregone. but you might have the ability later then to convert it into normal shares. After the investment period is over, maybe they've got the return that they wanted. They just want to be regular shareholders. You get quite a bit with that. So preference shares is probably the sexy one, if you will, and something that the investors are really that when you get investment, that's what they normally go for. Obviously, we can help you with that as well.
Definitely.
I think just to, again, there's loads. Big one, I've spoke about in the previous webinar, growth shares, which is another way that you can give shares to your employees. And this is probably used a lot by companies to motivate their senior hires. It's kind of very, 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 very long story short. What happens is the growth shares say, right, hang on a minute, let's ring fence the value that you've built for your shares here. Of your company. Fantastic, well done, you get to enjoy that. Now, all the growth above this line, above that ring fence amount, that will get enjoyed. Any of that growth, the people that have the growth shares will participate. And the purpose being is they don't get to take all of that amount that you had, that you built up with your blood, sweat and tears and your sleepless nights and so forth. It's saying, look, right, that was my doing. Don't touch my doing. Mm-hmm. But if you come on board and you help me push this even further above that level, you're gonna enjoy that. As I say, that's a fantastically simplified version, but it's used by a lot of companies, particularly for the senior hires. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of other share classes out there. Things like redeemable shares. Deferred shares aren't really a class that is used in the practical sense. They're more used as for something else, but there are quite a few classes out there. And the weird thing is actually companies just have many different. They can assign all sorts of rights they want. The only reason we talk about these different categories, growth and alphabet and so forth, is because it's just grown naturally. We have a certain expectation of what we're going to get, or it might be related to some tax advantage scheme, all these sorts of things. Plenty out there, plenty to choose from. Personally, if you're in a company with multiple people, I always think multiple classes are probably definitely something you want to give serious thought to.
Definitely, and I think we can squeeze one last question in. But I think I've given myself too many shares at incorporation. Can I remove unwanted shares? And if I do this, is my liability reduced?
Yeah, very simply, so long as you got as long as you get the relevant approvals, then the reduction of capital is probably the favoured route that most people will go through there. The reduction of capital, as I say, will cancel those shares, and if you have liability on there, the liability will be extinguished. So let's just say you had a company with 100 shares of £1 each, so you had £100 liability, and you reduced it to one share of £1. Then you've extinguished, as long as you've done it right, you've extinguished the liability on those 99 shares, £99 worth. So yeah, you will be able to bring that down. Reduction of capital is probably the main way people do this. There's other ways that it can be done. And yeah, as long as it's done right, it hasn't been paid up, that liability will be extinguished.
Lovely. And if that is you, like we say, give us a call and we can help you out with that. But that is all we have time for today. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for sending through all the questions that we've gone through. If you haven't heard your question be read out today, please don't worry. We will endeavour to get those answers out to you after the webinar today. Now, this session has also been recorded, so if you do have any parts that you want to go back and re-watch, this will be up on our YouTube channel. Give us about 24, 48 hours to get that up there, and you can go have a watch of this episode again. If you do want to watch any of our other videos, there's plenty of videos up there on the YouTube channel of Nick explaining a whole range of topics when it comes to all things companies and limited companies. Now, if you do have any further questions, if you'd like to speak to anyone, feel free to give us a call, or you can send us an email on talks@firstformations.co.uk. Our team will be happy to speak with you and kind of run through anything you're looking to get some more information on. But aside from that, like I say, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you.
Cheerio.